And then, fast forward 10 years plus, and, Lucas, now part of Disney, and they're doing a lot more of licensing and working with people. And so I knew some folks there and said, I have this idea that I pitched a long time ago. And they loved it. And again, if you like Indiana Jones, it is a definite love letter to Indiana Jones and everything with it.
Choo choo, choo choo, ha 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 ha.
Within the past few years, Bethesda hasn't exactly garnered the greatest track record, both as a publisher and creative studio. With the infamous launch of Fallout 76, to the subsequent disaster that was Wolfenstein Youngblood, which has still left the series hanging in limbo to this day. And while Starfield can technically be considered a success for Bethesda commercially, I think it's safe to say the game's fundamentally broken design and shallow world building fell quite flat of possibly salvaging the reputation they once had, nor would it be enough to cover the cataclysmic money pit that was Redfall. In May of 2024, Matt Booty, head of Xbox Game Studios, announced that all development on the game would cease, followed with the closure of Arcane Austin and Tango Gameworks. There was no shred of plausible deniability for Microsoft to hide behind. It's evident that Xbox as a brand has tried to mask their incompetence by forking out billions of dollars to acquire their competition to remain relevant in the gaming space, but their severe mismanagement of all these development teams under their wing has created a tidal wave of studio absolvments and shutdowns. And had the Great Circle not been slapped with the Indiana Jones label, I firmly believe it would have been lambasted like all of the other AAA high-budget modern slop that Xbox has recently churned out. Because the Great Circle relies heavily on brand recognition and nostalgia baiting in an attempt to distract the player from not only how broken a lot of its systems are, but how the writers have a fundamental misunderstanding of Indy as a character and have created a narrative that is completely incongruent with the mainline trilogy. Because Mr. 16 Times the Detail himself was an executive producer for this game, and much like how the nightmare-fueled Fallout adaptation was force-hammered into the continuity of those games,
You wanna make my cock explode now?
we have the reverse happening with the Great Circle. Crazy coincidence, I know. Regardless, I suppose we should start things off with addressing the combat. It is profoundly dogshit. 95% of enemy NPCs do not have guns, and the fringe amount that do will not shoot you if you are purely engaging in melee combat. On top of that, guards are also restricted to specific zones or areas and will not chase you once they reach a certain distance. This obviously makes exploiting the sandbox portions of the game laughably easy, even on the highest difficulty setting, because you can tear through an entire group of soldiers with your fists in the Vatican Gardens, for example, and the black shirts in the next section over won't have any reaction to it because they're strictly bound to their zone. And even then, you can just straight up unload on an entire military checkpoint and they just won't chase after you. Boss fights, while few in number, are still horribly designed and would have probably suited the game way better if they were removed entirely. All of them boil down to parry the very obvious incoming attack and then spam your melee. Or you can just do what I did and trap the boss on a nearby asset and gun them down. It more or less goes without saying by now that the AI pathing and detection is outright abysmal. They seem incapable of reacting to things happening around them or navigating basic terrain/obstacles. If you're on higher ground that they don't have access to, again, they will chunk rocks at you instead of using a pistol. Which is just really fucking weird. Like, I'm in the middle of the Vatican City slaughtering Mussolini's paramilitary. Why the hell are they chunking rocks at me?
It's a big, beautiful old rock.
Well, it turns out that the creative director for the game claimed in interviews that they didn't want to, quote, encourage gunplay because it wouldn't be true to the character. Which, holy fuck, mothering Christ, you're really gonna make me roll the clips, aren't you? But then this quote further begs the question of why even bother to make the Great Circle a first-person shooter if you adamantly design the combat to not encourage gunplay. By their own admission, the game simply isn't equipped to deal with the player getting their hands on one, so why give Indy a revolver in the first place and have so much ammo for it scattered throughout the maps? To say that the Great Circle is mechanically confused would be a resounding understatement, and one of the best examples that highlights this would be the canine unit combat, if you can truly even call it that, because to put it simply, you cannot kill or even so much as hurt dogs in this game. Even if they are actively trying to maul your arm off, it does not matter. You as the player only have two options: run away or crack your whip in their direction, and they will maybe, heavy emphasis on the word maybe, lay down on the ground temporarily, in which you will still have to run away because if you stay within their general area, they will stand back up and try to bite you again. For a game that's main selling point is making the player feel like Indy, these toothless systems constantly break any semblance of immersion due to how clunky and fundamentally broken every facet of the combat is. The devs may claim that they didn't want to encourage gunplay specifically, but it couldn't be more painfully obvious that there was zero interest in creating an action title, period. Even some of the more forced stealth sections of the game are beyond embarrassing. However, since we're still relatively on the subject of immersion, and I realize this is rather subjective, so take this for what it's worth, but I found the constant shifting between first to third back to first person to be really jarring. It's one thing to change the camera perspective during an intense action sequence worth showing, but a majority of the time whenever the game switches to third person, it's during tedious traversal sections that bog the pacing down to a grinding crawl, and the Great Circle is packed with these sections. I'm personally not against having an Indiana Jones game set in first person, but the devs have to commit to one or the other, and it's another stark example of the devs not having the slightest clue how they want the player to engage and interact with the game. This then bleeds over into what is one of the more frustrating creative decisions that I think has ever been put in a video game, and is unfortunately handcuffed to the Great Circle. And frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if there are mods soon that will attempt to fix this. But you cannot store weapons that you pick up regardless of what it is. If you go to use your whip to climb up to a platform above you, for example, you will drop whatever item you're holding. If you want to vault over a railing or pull yourself up on top of a small rock formation, you will drop what you're holding below you. Hell, if you even just so much as want to apply a bandage, doesn't matter, you will be forced to drop your item and then pick it back up again. This may seem like a small issue, but with how often you'll be using melee weapons, or items in general for that matter, it gets incredibly goddamn annoying very quickly, because you're constantly having to scramble around for another weapon as soon as you perform the most menial of tasks, which is only made worse with the insanely inconsistent weapon degradation. Sometimes a 3-slot weapon will take all of its hits to bring a guy down, while another can knock a soldier out with just one, or sometimes not deplete any slots at all. Sure, there's a wide variety of melee weapons that can be used during combat, but I'd rather have a select set that I can store in my inventory and have a consistent metric for how they function and degrade, versus an ocean of random question marks that I'll barely spend time using. In fairness, there are a couple of disguises Indy can wear that have their own dedicated batons or canes, but they only have 3 slots before having to be repaired, assuming you even have a repair kit in your inventory to begin with. And speaking of disguises, while I do like the overall concept of using them to progress through certain sections of the game while maintaining a low profile, in execution, they're, well, jank, to put it lightly. I thought for sure there would be some limit to what you could actually do in these outfits before your cover is blown completely, causing some form of fail state, especially during the Vatican level. But no, actually. As long as you don't die, you can cause as much chaos and murder as you want. Just to really power drive this home, on the highest difficulty, I ziplined across an entire restricted dig site during broad daylight, bonked a guy on the head with my shovel, then picked up a whole-ass broom and beat a guy to death with it, and the other enemy NPCs had no idea because I was in disguise, holy shit!
I think Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is the best Xbox exclusive in years. That is where I haven't finished it quite yet.
The best Indiana Jones game we've ever had, and probably will ever have, because it's the license that carries this thing regardless.
All it works well as an Indiana Jones simulator, yes, but also just a real authentic, genuine feeling trip back into the world of Indiana Jones.
But I really believe that Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is an all-timer, and we're going to be talking about it like 20 years from now.
The state of most modern video games have really just lowered my standards in general lately. Everything is full of microtransactions and battle passes, live services, and hell, even single-player games have microtransactions now. But with all of that said, I really liked Indiana Jones and the Great Circle.
And honestly, it feels like the lost movie or the lost chapter in the Indiana Jones film trilogy. It slots greatly in between Raiders of the Lost Ark and essentially The Last Crusade.
That is without a doubt the dumbest thing I've ever heard. You are a fucking idiot.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to call some absolute fucking barnacles on that last one, because this game incorporates some pretty wild shit that does not line up with the other three films at all. Not that it doesn't shamelessly attempt to sell you that it has the same gravitas as the original Indy trilogy, because The Great Circle kicks off with a discount recreation of the opening scene from Raiders, which I honestly can't think of a more creatively bankrupt way to start off what is supposed to be a new spiritually canonical entry to the Indiana Jones series. The whole time playing through this section, I just wanted to Alt F4 and watch the actual movie instead. Because the movie didn't have these clunky QuickTime events that screw with the pacing of events happening in motion, or have Indy screwing around during the part in the scene where the shrine is supposed to be crumbling around him. There's no tension because the gameplay is completely disconnected with what's supposed to be happening narratively.
And the con with the intro of Great Circle is that, just like most games, it's a tutorial. Nobody who has a functional brain enjoys tutorials. The Great Circle knows this, so they disguise their tutorial as a remake of the first part of Raiders of the Lost Ark.
If it actually served as a tutorial, I would agree with you, but it absolutely is not one. You never actually use your pistol or engage in combat in any way during this opening. There's a set path with scripted moments and some QTE sprinkled in. At best, it's an interactive cutscene that's main goal is to illustrate that this game takes place between Raiders and The Last Crusade, though I'd argue that this is one of the few instances where a throwaway line would have been better suited with getting that point across. Because it turns out that level was actually a dream Indy was having and wakes up during the middle of the night at Marshall College. He hears some commotion going on in the museum only to stumble upon a really tall Tony Todd. An awkward boss fight ensues where you're abruptly forced into a fail state and presented with the title card. This intro may seem inconsequential, but it already creates a massive plot hole, which, frankly, will be easier to tackle later on in the video, so we're going to stick a pin in that for the meantime. But it does also set the tone for what we can expect from this iteration of Indy throughout most of the Great Circle. Because instead of a larger-than-life figure, a daring explorer, and someone who embodies the ideals and moral values of a bygone era, we're left with an impulsive klutz who is constantly in service to other characters that the writers seem to hold in higher regard.
Are you familiar with the Chechapoyan fertility idol last seen with a certain Renee Belloc, the grave robber? Anyway, I want to put together an expedition to recover it, and I was wondering if you would be interested in sponsoring such an...
I'll consider it.
All right. Much appreciated, Dane Wall.
I have to get her back. Then we go.
One question, Dr. Jones. What makes you any different from Voss? You are both here to steal our cultural heritage.
No, I'm not here to steal anything. But to ask for your permission. I have the greatest respect for your culture and its history. The Idol of Ra.
Voss believes it to be here, Dr. Jones.
What is it?
It's a statue, perhaps this big, cursed with a terrible power, according to the old Egyptian legend.
It's been lost for thousands of years. No one's known where to look for it.
So why does Voss think that the idol is here in Giza?
Perhaps he thinks old Khufu had it.
Khufu built the Great Pyramid as his personal tomb. If he did have the idol, then he would...
He would want to hide its power from the world.
Power of the stone. Dame the Wall, you're a genius.
Am I?
Sure, there have been moments where he's been manipulated or outmatched, but he's always used his wits to make a daring escape. Here, he's spared because the plot simply needed him to be. But a few hours pass and Marcus wakes up Indy, where they both discover that Tony Todd has stolen an Egyptian cat mummy and also left his necklace behind. Which, like, how did he lose it there? It'd be different if it was torn off and ended up on the floor, but this looks like it was purposely placed there. Also, it's not like losing a necklace while wearing one is necessarily an easy thing to ignore. Why didn't he go back for it? I guess he doesn't need it to access super secret passages that only take that specific sigil. Conveniently for Indy, though, they're able to easily decipher the symbol on the medallion.
That looks Catholic to you, doesn't it?
It's the sigil of the Vatican's secret archive, if I'm not mistaken.
This isn't just about a cat mummy, Marcus.
Come now, Indiana, you can't travel to Italy. The college would never sanction leave for this, not in the middle of midterms.
Why wouldn't they? A crazy guy just broke into the campus museum and ran off with an ancient Egyptian artifact. There hasn't been any issue with him doing this in the past. Plus, there's not really much teaching that goes on during midterms week. Students just take the test and leave. This is equally strange coming from Marcus, the guy who more or less helped kick off the entire events of Raiders by introducing Indy to a couple of Army intelligence officials. But either way, Indy loads up his suitcase and takes off for Vatican City, where we're introduced to Father Antonio. There's not much really to his character. He exists mainly to give you a couple of important gameplay items, and you learn that he really likes jazz and hates the black shirts. That's right, it turns out the reason for their presence here is that the Pope is dying and that a fascist sympathizer priest, Father Ventura, practically runs the Vatican now. Except all of this is wildly ahistorical and simply not how the papacy works. Cardinals would be the ones with any form of legislative and executive power, and they would have viewed black shirts setting up military checkpoints or restricted zones as a threat against their sovereignty. Not to mention Mussolini violating the Lateran Treaty would have lost him a ton of support, seeing as the country at the time was predominantly Catholic. I think having the black shirts as a faction for Indy to square off against makes sense, but the setting does not. And speaking of things that make zero sense, Indy and Antonio eventually discover that a bunch of insignias with Latin inscriptions across the city reveal that a giant is buried underneath Pope Nicholas V's tower.
The architect of the crusade that did not happen. The door of the fallen angel lies beneath his monument.
A crusade that did not happen. Dum diversas.
The papal bull.
Yes. After the fall of Constantinople, Pope Nicholas V tried to declare a crusade on the Ottomans, but...
It didn't happen. Nicholas V, his tower. That's his monument. The demon guards the way to the underworld, where the tomb of the warrior giant lies.
A demon? A fallen angel? Mother of God, the Father Crescenzo was onto something.
How has this remained a secret for over 4 centuries? These things are scattered all over the city. The only way they could be less subtle is if there were giant neon signs pointing directly at them. No one even bothered with translating these statues? Or, pouring wine in this fucking bowl? I've seen a ton of praise for how great the exploration/puzzles are in the Great Circle, but I simply couldn't disagree more. Their existence in the world is narratively half-baked at best, and the vast majority of them involve either turning a thing until another thing happens, or being told the code to a safe and then entering that code.
Gaming.
After delving further down, though, as Indy is attempting to open the tomb, well, this happens.
Dumb bitch.
Way to go, jackass. You uncovered a burial site dating all the way back to the First Crusade, and without even the slightest bit of hesitation, immediately destroyed it. So much for putting that shit in a museum. The actual Indy from the original trilogy would be livid that this has happened. But hey, let's force hammer in some quippy sarcasm. That'll fix everything, right?
Sure you won't mind.
God, kill me. However, upon learning the location of the entrance to the Nephilim Order, Indy returns to the surface and notices a nun picking a lock. He follows her to a nearby balcony where the both of them then spot the main villain of the game, Emmerich Voss, a Nazi archaeologist being greeted by Father Ventura and old Benny Boy Mussolini himself. Conveniently, it just so happens that Gina's sister has gone missing, and she believes that Emmerich Voss is responsible. And it's even more convenient that Indy just so happens to know her sister.
That's Dr. Laura Lombardi.
Do you know her?
She's one of the world's leading experts in ancient languages.
For those of you who haven't touched this game, I think you're already seeing where this is headed. That's right, in typical fashion, the two of them agree to help each other, and you are shackled to Gina for the rest of the plot. And while I will give the writers some credit where it's due for not making Gina nearly as insufferable as Fleabag from Dial of Destiny, she is still pretty goddamn annoying. She suffers from the typical modern AAA companion trope of telling you the answer to a puzzle before you even begin one, spamming the same line of dialogue over and over again in order to get the player to start the next cutscene, and will randomly fistfight nearby soldiers while you're trying to stealth.
That's one.
The keys of St. Peter.
Maybe we need to forge those signals.
I think you're right.
Stay behind the shield!
God! 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 That was too close! God!
Plus, for a character that the devs/writers insist is an intellectual equal to Indy, she frequently has to have basic shit explained to her. Like, for instance, who her sister is.
Parts that look like cuneiform.
I thought you were an expert, Dr. Jones.
I am. Only one person in the world that knows more about dead languages than me.
Who's that?
Your sister, Dr. Laura Lombardi. That's Dr. Laura Lombardi.
Do you know her?
She's one of the world's leading experts in ancient languages.
Who's that?
Your sister, Dr. Laura Lombardi.
I don't know if I can properly express just how close I was to immediately uninstalling after being subjected to that struggle session tier dialogue. And I wish I could say that's the worst of it, but her whole arc throughout this entire game consists of originally thinking Indy is a heartless grave robber, to not thinking that anymore.
When we first met, I thought you were a heartless grave robber.
And, what do you think now?
And I was wrong.
Absolute peak character development, that is, especially for someone who's supposed to be a journalist. On top of being a professor of archaeology, his expeditions and adventures in the pursuit of trying to preserve history at this point are well known. There's also the tidbit of him agreeing to help find her missing sister, who she barely brings up after learning about Laura's death and that she was effectively coerced into working with the Nazis, by the way. Why would heartless opportunist be Gina's initial take on Indy? You know, I might have spoken too soon about this game not stealing pages from Dial of Destiny's book.
Well, I'm not the one that's engaged to a mobster!
I don't need morality lessons from an aging grave robber!
Getting back on track though, the two of them sneak their way into the Vatican archive and locate the cat mummy, only for Tony Todd to randomly pop up again, where I gunned him down almost instantly. Again, zero stakes or tension is very much a recurring theme throughout the Great Circle. If you think I'm exaggerating, immediately after this fight, Father Ventura leads Voss and Mussolini into the archive, where the Nazis start breaking open multiple artifacts, including the cat mummy, to retrieve these special stones written in a mythological dead language called Adamic. Luckily, they only search part of the room filled with ancient relics and antiques, because had they bothered to just look around the corner, Indy and Gina would have absolutely been screwed here. Not that they make much of an effort to remain hidden. I swear to God, there's multiple times throughout this cutscene where they should have been clearly spotted, but I guess everyone in this room has a 5-inch field of view. But as the two of them pursue the Nazis and stow away in their Zeppelin, this is unfortunately where the plot decides to dive off a cliff and go full schizo mode.
The Great Circle's the biggest mystery in all of archaeology. Do you even know what it is? That's the Earth. Now, throughout history, mankind has built sites of great spiritual significance. Siwa, Giza, Persepolis, Mohenjo-Daro, Sukhothai, Nazca, Machu Picchu. Now, here's the strange part. If you were to draw a line through these ancient sites around the globe, you get a perfectly aligned circle.
Nazis don't care about history, Dr. Jones. They only care about power.
Legend says that the Great Circle does have some power, something about its geometry.
Oh, lovely. They've sent me a moron.
Holy hell, where to even begin with all this? The Great Circle theory, as posed by Jim Allison, was, and still very much is, a fringe internet conspiracy theory that was posted on a random blog post back in 2001, and even at the time was heavily torn into for how pseudo-archaeological its claims were. So having Indy cite this during 1937 as being archaeology's greatest mystery makes no sense, let alone having it serve as the core premise for an Indiana Jones adventure. Up until the last two films, the franchise operated solely on well-known historical legends or religious symbolism/mythology. And while, yes, the Sankara stones were an entirely made-up MacGuffin for the Temple of Doom, Lucas and Spielberg still used major deities and symbolism from Hinduism as a loose basis for the plot. The Great Circle and its respective historical sites, while having spiritual/religious aspects, are used more of a backdrop than having any relevant connection to the actual MacGuffins of the plot. Because it's also revealed toward the end of the game, in equally schizoid fashion.
You found the Ark of the Covenant, yes, but I found Noah's Ark. It details the story of the flood myth and its connection to the Great Circle. The Metatron, the voice of God, was sent down to instruct a mortal man, let's call him Noah, to build a giant vessel. The Ark. The angel gave Noah 17 stones, all imbued with the power to fold the earth. Yes! 17 stones, 17 words. Each stone connected to one of the locations of the Great Circle. Noah used the stones to gather animals from around the world, and then, after the flood was over, to repopulate the earth. And the stones were left hidden at each of the Great Circle sites under the protection of this ghastly race of giants. Nephilim. Yes. Some legends blamed the flood on them, so they needed redemption. But over time, the stones were lost, stolen, forgotten, so the giants formed an alliance with the Vatican to seek out and find the stones again.
This is shit. This is shit. This is shit.
That means for 350 years after the flood, Noah and all of his family that were aboard the Ark knew in some capacity that the Western Hemisphere and other unexplored parts of the Eastern Hemisphere existed, but told absolutely no one about it for whatever reason. Furthermore, how could the stones have been placed back at their specific locations after the flood, when the only way to precisely fold the earth is to have all 17 stones slotted in the Ark and speak the Adamic words in the correct sequence?
Now, as your dear sister found out the hard way, using just a single stone is extremely unpredictable, completely useless for warfare. No. We need all the stones.
But wait, there's more.
It turns out that the Nephilim, the descendants of fallen angels who had been wiped out by the flood due to there being no biblical account of any of the Nephilim being on board the Ark, were somehow tasked with protecting these stones at their respective sites immediately after the flood, but at some point along the way decided that they would be safer kept in the Vatican, which is effectively under Mussolini's control.
What are you?
An idiot sandwich.
And absolutely none of this dumb fuckery still explains how any of these historical sites built along the Great Circle have any connection to the stones. You could argue that maybe the Nephilim ordered them built to house the relics, but sites like Machu Picchu, for example, weren't constructed until around the mid-15th century. The Great Circle itself is also one big nothing burger. The stones could exist anywhere on the planet and not lose their power, but the Nephilim originally decided they should all be hidden along this arbitrary line. Keep in mind, too, all of this was done with finding redemption in the eyes of God, so why would that only just extend to protecting the stones? Why were they not involved with preventing the Nazis from getting their hands on the Ark of the Covenant? Or bothered helping the Brotherhood of the Cruciform Sword protect the Holy Grail, especially if they already formed an alliance with the Vatican? They clearly wanted to mirror the Last Crusade by having the Nephilim be this mysterious and misunderstood order, But unlike Kazum, Locus and his brigade of smooth brains are solely responsible for why generic Nazi badman was able to get his hands on all the stones, and then has the balls to lecture Indy about being just as bad as Voss.
If you would have told me a year ago that they were going to make an Indiana Jones game that actually was a quality of the old movies with an old Harrison Ford that didn't have an AI voice that sounded like him, like if you would have told me this a year ago, I wouldn't have believed you. This game blew me away. And in many cases, I feel is an evolution of the medium that I love and appreciate so much.
Go shit in your hat. This half-assed glued together mess of a game might not be as insulting as Dial of Destiny, but it certainly isn't any less retarded. Everyone on the internet bitches and moans about the state of the AAA space and the decline of modern gaming, but all it took was a discount copy-pasted Memberberries intro to get the vast majority of you clapping like seals, and so now Disney is going to greenlight more of this slop. But hey, at least it's on Game Pass.
There's going to be more change in how some of the traditional ways that games were built and distributed. That's going to change. That's going to change for all of us. But the end result has to be better games that more people can play. If we're not focused on that, I think we're focused on the wrong things.
Choo-choo! Choo-choo!